it's in fact a myth perpetrated on YouTube and the internet that there are ancient myths of dying and rising gods in the ancient world.
The consensus of scholars today is that the Christians did not borrow the myths of dying and rising gods from pagan myths.
Have any of you ever heard that Jesus is not special? He's just like these other guys. He's just another pagan deity. They all rose from the dead. They all died. They were born of a virgin, that kind of stuff. How many of you have heard that before? Yeah. Well, it's all nonsense. So sometimes they'll bring up Dionysus and they'll say Dionysus turned water into wine. Yeah, that comes from a 3rd century text. Postdates the New Testament. Shut up.
If you know anything about Christian apologetics, it becomes very clear that most of the popular ones approach defending the Bible as though the facts are clearly on their side.
Jesus Christ, who are you?
Their confidence in discussing this sensitive issue is actually very appealing to many who have never actually gone back into the ancient sources, checking it for themselves.
Here's the truth about Mithras. Number one, it's too late to influence Christianity because it's after Christianity.
Are these apologists lying? Are they telling me the truth? Are they factually correct? This is exactly where I found myself, scratching for the truth 9 years ago, as a Christian who loved listening to William Lane Craig and Ravi Zacharias, world-famous Christian defenders.
Historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
God, who caused the light to shine out of darkness, has caused his light to shine in our hearts, to give to us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus, our Lord. So said Paul.
I was one of these guys, like an apologist, who wanted to change the world by making everyone become a Christian.
Now it's time to live for him. Whom the sun sets free is free indeed.
Using my passion for defending my faith. I've always been that guy who wanted to know more and gain a much deeper understanding. But most importantly, my prayer as a young born-again Christian, and I remember saying it all the time, Lord, give me the wisdom of Solomon.
Everyone in here, other than open theists, believe in predestination. It's how it's defined is different. Most people are comfortable, well, he sees what happens beforehand. I believe that God is working all things, every minute molecule.
Was that I had the wisdom of Solomon and could understand the truth. Wherever, I would always emphasize, wherever it would take me. In a way, this prayer came true, but it took me down a path I literally never, and I mean this, never thought I would go down. Okay, so I've been investigating something for years now, and have probably gone deeper on this subject than any other subject. It was a topic I never thought I would have investigated on this level, especially as a devout Christian, but once I started seeing the evidence, I couldn't put it down. I'm investigating the resurrection of Jesus and the real origins of Christianity. Does Christianity have pagan roots? Is Christianity mythology? I found that Christian apologists have 3 usual ways they deal with this issue. 1, they completely deny any parallels, borrowings, or similarities to Jesus.
And these internet people who are still pushing it are over 100 years out of touch with scholarship on this issue. Number 1, the parallels turned out to be spurious. In fact, there are no parallels in ancient mythology of dying and rising deities.
2, they admit the parallels are there, but Satan or demons made those other gods and their claims look like Jesus.
C.S. Lewis said if the story of the gospel is true, you would expect to see pagan reflections of it. In other words, you would expect to see spiritual counterfeits. You would expect to see other things in other ancient religions and faiths that try to mimic this, but that will only underscore the differences. So you have pagan parallels. That's not a big surprise.
3, These myths that had parallels all came after Christianity and borrowed from Jesus.
So sometimes they'll bring up Dionysus and they'll say Dionysus turned water into wine. Yeah, that comes from a 3rd century text. Postdates the New Testament. Shut up.
Wow, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, literally, this subject is so complex and the apologists want to wave it off as ridiculous.
Well, it's all nonsense.
I'm here to tell you, once you take this topic serious, there's no turning back. I ask that you try your best to be as honest and open-minded as possible.
Let me give you one piece of advice. Be honest.
It can be a bit nerve-wracking and fearful to venture into the unknown. I know exactly how that feels.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes.
But you're here for a reason. You really want to know the truth.
This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
It all began years ago when I was surfing YouTube and came across this documentary called Zeitgeist. Immediately, the first section, titled "The Greatest Story Ever Told," had me hooked. Here I was, a young, passionate Christian, pretty confident that his religion was the only true one and everyone else's was wrong. For the first time in my life, I actually heard someone make this statement that the story of Jesus was heavily influenced by pre-existing myths, particularly from Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions. Whoever this guy was, he was saying Jesus was a sun god myth like all the other myths.
To find out, let's examine the most recent of the solar messiahs.
This was a very different approach than anything I had ever heard. They weren't attacking the Bible as the famous atheists Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins did.
I think maybe I will take a few minutes just to say something that I find repulsive about especially monotheistic messianic religion. With a large part of itself, it quite clearly wants us all to die. It wants this world to come to an end. You can tell the yearning for things to be over.
Here we have a God who wanted to forgive mankind its sins, including, by the way, the sin of Adam, who he presumably knew perfectly well never existed. Nevertheless, he wanted to forgive mankind's sins. Why didn't he just forgive them? Why was it necessary to have a human sacrifice, to have his son tortured and executed in order that the sins of mankind should be absolved?
I personally couldn't stand those guys back in those days. So hearing that there were patterns in the stories of Jesus and all these other gods made me think, what if I'm wrong about Jesus? After watching it, I found the Zeitgeist Debunked documentaries where Christians picked each claim of Zeitgeist apart. My faith remained intact. However, the seed of curiosity grew inside me. So who's right and who's wrong? This started my journey into investigating the Christian story of Jesus dying and rising from the dead. I need to know whether Jesus was just another copy of pagan myths, or did his story really happen? Were there really earlier stories of gods who died and resurrected? A few years later, I received an email from someone who was once in the same Christian online community as me. He told me that he had information that may blow my mind about the Bible. He asked that I never mention his name publicly, because his mother would literally croak if she heard that he was saying some of the things that he was telling me. I was like, of course I won't tell people your name, but I said I needed to know something from him. My gut was telling me something. He said, ask away. Are you an atheist? Yes, but he told me that he didn't care if I believed in God. He just wanted to share information that he discovered. He was so friendly, I just had a hard time believing he was an atheist. My understanding of them was that they were all terrible people with so much anger and hate in their heart. This guy was different. He went on to tell me that the story of Samson was likely a sun myth, similar to the strongman Hercules from the Greeks and Romans. I asked, "What makes you think that?" He laughed and said, "So many details, but let's just start with his name." The name Samson, Hebrew Shimshon, comes from the Hebrew word shemesh, meaning sun. So Samson's name interprets to mean sun-like or little sun. This is seen in the Samson's strength and radiant power, which aligns metaphorically with the sun's immense energy. Interesting. He continued to impress me with ideas about this story I've never heard before. Samson's name seems to have connections with the Mesopotamian sun god Shamash. Samson has 7 locks of hair, and if they get cut off, he loses his strength. These 7 locks are the 7 days of the week, where the sun's rays shine forth. Samson represented the sun, he said. The little son Samson faced a lion, defeating it barehanded. The lion represents the constellation Leo. The son Samson was betrayed by the moon Delilah, and the moon cuts the sun's hair off, causing either an eclipse or the winter solstice to occur. Even Delilah was paid in silver, which is the same color as the moon. This all really piqued my interest to hear more. I needed to know more about this idea. It was just so interesting to start looking outside of the narrow box I was always thinking in. Look, I've listened to apologetics and teachings from Christians most of my life, and I literally have never heard anything even close to something like this. My friend would send me videos with people like Manly P. Hall, who was a mystic who studied ancient myths in the early 20th century.
Truth is not essentially a system or a school, but as all the ancients realized, truth is a living thing.
He also introduced Acharya S., aka D.M. Murdoch, to me. She said many things that the movie Zeitgeist was saying, and come to find out, she actually contributed to that movie.
The only way you can sustain this story, really, is to have it in a vacuum, is to remove all practicality around it, all the other cultures. Seriously, you would have to be absolutely ignorant of all history, mythology, culture, language of the time in order to maintain that story. Unfortunately, that's what we find. There is quite a lot of ignorance and willful ignorance. I've actually had debates with people who have said, "Oh, I don't want to know anything about those pre-Christian cultures because they were all evil." I can't give you any evidence then at that point. You've completely closed off. There's no way I can prove a thing. You have no interest in looking at the pre-Christian culture. So, yeah, we're in a catch-22 with this one. And yeah, it becomes a matter of faith. They have no problem. There is that special pleading again. We can believe this without a stitch of evidence because it's faith. But we can't believe anything that you've said without a mountain of evidence that we will still reject at the end of the day.
So here I am, entertaining the idea that Jesus was possibly a sun myth based on earlier sun myths. I started this very channel inspired by these ideas. I mean, Zeitgeist literally highlights the largest natural phenomena to our experience, the sun, paints how important it is, its significance with time and agricultural and humanity at large. It all felt so real that this might be something true, or at least there was something true about it. Now I know this all seems a bit like a conspiracy theory on steroids. If I were to walk into any college today where experts in New Testament studies is taught, they would have probably thought this was nuts. I honestly didn't understand why this was thought to be so ridiculous, when many of these experts themselves thought a dead man literally came back to life in 3 days. Who's ridiculous? I was labeled a conspiracy theorist by some of the apologists I once looked up to for facts about Jesus, meaning I saw videos where they mocked and were condescending toward people like me who thought maybe Jesus is a complete myth. This was a real head scratcher. On the one hand, thinking Jesus may have been a completely invented figure based off other myths was laughed at by not only the apologist, who, let's be honest, I expect to be defensive about this, but also the academics. I mean, seriously, 95% of their students think a dead guy who is said to be God in the flesh died and came back to life, changed water into wine, walked on water, the list goes on. And this isn't laughed at. But the idea that Jesus may have been invented as a mythical figure is a joke among these scholars. It really didn't add up. My thought was the money coming from the Christian students may have played a significant part of how mythicists get treated. I mean, imagine if the universities ran off the funds of mythicists and not the other way around. Would they treat them the same way? So I discovered that I was what they call a Jesus mythicist. This was a simple term that says Jesus was 100% myth and never existed in any way. My investigation led me to try contacting Acharya S. But sadly, she had died a few years before I discovered these ideas. I was late to the party, just like I found out Jesus was late as well. My current supervisor position in construction left me with little time to pursue recordings with people who are experts in this area. But after 12-hour shifts, day in and day out, traveling from hotel to hotel, I found the time to listen, and the birth of the idea of recording chats with some of these thinkers began. Then I discovered Dr. Robert M. Price. Here was a guy who had 2 PhDs, meaning the dude was really smart.
What more do you need, Craig? What more do you need, Gish or D'Souza? How many hundreds of times does this have to be disproven for you to stop using this? There's this great quote. Tillich says, fundamentalism has demonic aspects in that it splits the conscience of its thoughtful adherents and forces them to repress knowledge of which they are secretly aware. So why is the fundamentalist and the apologist on the warpath? Well, it's against himself. The unbeliever that he goes on crusade against is in his own mind.
He was also a mythicist. Jesus didn't exist. And the best part, he only lived 45 minutes away from my house. Holy shit. I think I hit the jackpot. I did what anyone would do, passionate about investigating the truth. So I drove, bringing my entire damn computer with the worst audio in the world, just to try documenting what this guy had to say.
Do you think that one day that the mythicist approach, or the idea that Jesus may not have existed, might become the standard? The burden of proof will be on the historicist, like it should be, to really prove the existence of Jesus.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that would happen, except that pretty much that has happened in the case of the Old Testament.
Let's just say we hit it off and started a true friendship. I would travel to his house on a regular basis and read everything I could from him and anyone he recommended. Here I was, sitting with a guy who had debated one of my favorite apologists, William Lane Craig, that I looked up to, on the very topic, did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead.
Dr. Craig often appeals to the consensus of New Testament scholars on behalf of conservative views. By contrast, I am glad to confess that the opinion of the majority of scholars makes no difference whatever to me. In fact, in the Gospels, after all, it's a consensus of scholars in the Sanhedrin that condemns Jesus to death.
Confession. Years before this, I had purchased every audio and video I could find online with Ravi Zacharias and William Lane Craig. I had a passion for defending my Christian faith. Some years later, here I am sitting with one of the biggest skeptics and opposites of the Christian faith. He would poetically explain that the story of Jesus is anything but original. In his view, it borrows heavily from earlier pagan myths, especially those of gods who die and rise again, like Osiris, Dionysus, and Mithras. He sees clear parallels between Jesus' virgin birth, his miracles, and resurrection with these older myths. Even rituals like the Eucharist and baptism, Price says, mere pagan traditions where followers symbolically consumed their gods or underwent rebirth through water. For Price, early Christians adopted these well-known mythological motifs to craft a narrative that would resonate with the ancient world, fitting Jesus into a framework people already recognized. I thought to myself, Christians are never told any of this material. This is truly scandalous. Continuing my investigation, I discovered an excellent scholar, Dr. Richard Carrier. When I first encountered Dr. Richard Carrier, he looked familiar. I wasn't sure exactly where I remember seeing him, but then it dawned on me. He actually was one of the guys who debated William Lane Craig way back in the day on the Christian Apologist video, Line of Fire. I ordered all of these different videos and was watching them.
We're running out of time, so how do you respond to what Bill just said?
Well, just very quickly, we have no eyewitness account of what the original Christians actually saw, except from Paul. And Paul describes it in very visionary terms, and he doesn't mention any other kind of appearances. In Galatians, he says it was a revelation of Jesus Christ that was not an encounter with flesh and blood.
Oh, he doesn't say that, though, Richard, does he? I mean, he says that, I have seen Jesus our Lord. It's the same words that Mary Magdalene uses when she reports what she saw to the disciples.
And he calls it a revelation. He uses the word revelation.
Yes, it's a revelation, right?
He doesn't say he met him.
You can't equate that with vision, can you?
But you don't think that he met, like the doubting Thomas, that he touched the physical body of Jesus and handled the wounds. Do you really think that's true?
He also ended up debating William Lane Craig in a formal debate. So here's another man who's debated one of my favorite apologists I'm talking to. And the kicker, he himself wrote a peer-reviewed book on the historicity of Jesus, arguing that Jesus most likely didn't exist. His position was that Jesus was more likely myth than a historical person. But he clearly pointed out that it really didn't matter, because the character in the stories of the Gospels was a crafted character that didn't really do all the things described in these stories. Our friendship sparked off many recordings, and MythVision was on its way to growing more and more attention. These two thinkers really encouraged me to read far and wide. For this, I will be forever grateful. As time passed, I was able to connect with many other experts in the following years, and they all agreed that many of the stories about Jesus were completely made up, even if they didn't believe Jesus was a complete myth. This was the struggle. Many of these non-mythicist scholars pointed out that much of what is said by Jesus in the Gospels don't really reflect what he actually said. I took serious the countless scholarly arguments for a historical Jesus and found myself juggling the two options between a guy existing and being a complete myth with no historical basis. My current stance is that there was more likely a guy behind it all, which sparked the mythology known as Christianity. But at this point, don't put much stock in being overly confident in this position due to the highly mythical nature of the material. The early critic of Christianity, Celsus or Celsus, said the Gospels were myths as well, though he thought there was a guy. So here I am, years later, after talking with countless experts in the world on matters related to the Bible, ready to spill the beans of my discoveries. I must warn you, there's so much information from Apologetics that I will focus on just the Dionysus wine material today. Trust me, we will bring the goods for William Lane Craig on dying and rising gods in a future one. Needless to say, Dionysus is also a dying and rising god, but that will have to wait. Everyone, and I mean everyone, sees Jewish roots to Christian origins. The New Testament is peppered with quotes from Jewish scriptures. Jesus himself was Jewish. All his disciples were Jewish. And the earliest letters in the New Testament written by a guy named Paul, who was also Jewish. The Gospels show Jesus fulfilling prophecy as they quote these older texts, forcing Jesus into ancient scripture. Many Bible experts suggest the Gospel authors used the Hebrew Bible, Septuagint really, the LXX, as a source book to craft the story of Jesus. They suggest that many of the stories about Jesus were whole cloth invented based off the stories of Moses, Elijah, Elisha, and other figures. This is exactly the standard position by scholars in the field, the consensus. The real question is, did these gospel authors also model Jesus off of pagan myths? For those who don't know, many Hebrew Bible scholars recognize that Moses, Elijah, Elisha, and others are myths, characters who likely never existed in actual history. Are there other characters from pagan sources who may have inspired the Jesus narrative? When I say pagan, I just mean non-Jewish sources. It's like an invisible brick wall in our minds stands firmly erect, dividing between Jewish and non-Jewish sources in the Hellenistic period. This is a known myth. Yes, this is a myth, recycled by outdated scholarly conjecture. We know with certainty the Jews were thoroughly Hellenized by the first century. This means the ideas, culture, art, literature, philosophy, and gods influenced the Jewish world, and vice versa. The Greeks and Jews found ways to suggest they both come from a common ancestry, and often held sacred ideas that span back into the earliest epochs of human history. You can easily see this with Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, but we don't have time to unpack all of this here. Let's just say all of this historical research to truly understand what the world was like in which this New Testament literature was written truly took me for a ride that I'm still on and doubt the ride will ever end. Sometimes thinking back, I recall defending Jesus at all costs, even to the point of sometimes exaggerating a bit to keep the truth of Jesus strong in front of others. When we get defensive of things we hold in a very special place in our hearts, we're even willing to lie, whether it's conscious or unconscious. We will practically do anything to defend our cause. The analogy I would give is if someone went on attack with my family in some way, you can bank on me getting protective, whether the attack was true or false. Apologists have built a public reputation of being beacons of light in a dark world of falsehood, where they not only represent themselves, but also represent Christ. They cannot allow defeat. I know this firsthand. So turning to the words of Michael Jones.
So sometimes they'll bring up Dionysus and they'll say Dionysus turned water into wine. Yeah, that comes from a 3rd century text. Postdates the New Testament. Shut up.
Is this true? Should we just shut our damn mouths? To be blunt, it is Michael who should be shutting his mouth. I cannot help but dig at Michael because his ignorance is contagious, and this video popped off and got much attention that I know many who are sheep in his audience just eat up what he says as though he has completely debunked the myth view. Like me 10 years ago, sipping whatever William Lane Craig and others gave me to drink, the audience listening to Jones want it to be true.
Postdates the New Testament. Shut up.
They don't want to find out that their sacred tradition is deeply indebted to other gods or non-Jewish sources. As a prophet, I can predict that my evidence will get dismissed by Jones and other apologists in some clever way. But truth be told, Dionysus, the god of revelry, celebration, life, and wine, has performed countless wine miracles long before Jesus ever shows up. Not only does he beat Jesus to the punch with wine miracles, but he was the first one to the January 6th party. Not that January 6th. Apologists similar to Michael Jones will be the first to jump on Christians influencing the works of the 5th century AD Greek poet Nonnus of Panopolis, who is best known for writing Dionysiaca, the longest surviving poem from ancient times. With 48 books, this guy wrote a lot, and over 20,000 lines. This long poem tells the story of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, focusing on his adventures, including his campaign to India, love affairs, and triumphs. It is filled with vivid descriptions and blends of mythology with epic storytelling. Nonnus lived during a time when pagan and Christian beliefs coexisted, and he also wrote a poetic retelling of the Gospel of John, showing an interest in Christianity. Many scholars have observed the Christian influences on Nonnus, which Michael and other Christian apologists will confidently rejoice in pointing out, as would I. Their confidence should be strong here, because Nonnus is writing in an ever-growing Christian world, and his writings show Christian awareness. Can they be fair and notice the same things happening in the Gospels, but in reverse? I wonder what these apologists will do once we take a time machine back to when Christianity first started in a world dominated by Greeks and Romans with their popular gods such as Dionysus. Will they confidently say that Jesus is portrayed as a new Dionysus? No. Of course the Gospels were making Jesus the best Son of God out there. Common sense should tell us to look and see if there were other sons of God and how popular were they in the world in which the New Testament was written. Just like we would do for Nonnus in the 5th century AD, especially since their goal was to market the Gentile, also known as pagan world. The fact is, Christianity was influenced by the most popular cults in the world of that day. Why? Because Christianity was also a cult, competing in a world full of people who believed these other gods. Apologists who deny this are denying common sense and need to look at the ancient sources with me. We will give you undeniable evidence that Dionysus was the wine god who turned water into wine before Jesus, and John's gospel, which is a little later than the rest of the gospels, would have known this when making his Jesus perform this as his first miracle. I'm truly curious to know how charitable the apologist will be with the sources I present in this video. Because here's the facts. The oldest physical evidence of the New Testament so far discovered is a fragment the size of a credit card Papyrus 52. From which gospel? The Gospel of John. The very gospel where Jesus pulls a wine miracle stunt imitating Dionysus. This fragment is dated roughly to the late 2nd century, possibly the early 3rd by some of the latest scholarship. In Brent Nombri's book, God's Library, he makes this very case. It is strange that Justin Martyr doesn't reference this gospel when making his points about the Logos in roughly 155 to 165 AD. No worries, the Apologist will dissect all of this to bring you comfort that John's gospel somehow is a early 1st century gospel, and it reports facts about the actuality of what happened with Jesus and his unique wine miracles. You know what? I honestly just don't care to get lost in the back and forth distraction, and yes, it's a distraction, about dating this gospel, which we know cannot be firmly dated. Because I'll bring you one even better. I will show you sources that are before the 1st century, with Dionysus turning waters into wine. Yep, this is before Jesus even existed, and it will be more than one source. But just so you know, the Gospel of John is generally dated roughly around 100 AD-ish. However, more critical scholars see it likely reflecting later ideas and may have been crafted around 120 AD or even later than that. I have sources of Dionysus doing wine miracles, specifically water into wine ones, before this gospel is on the scene. This should raise eyebrows as to who came first and inspired who. Hopefully by the end of this, the evidence is clear. Thinking the Gospels aren't painting Jesus as a better god than Dionysus by having Jesus perform similar divine acts is like saying Nonnus from the 5th century AD isn't being influenced by Christian ideas. Let me be the one to introduce you to one of the greatest gods to roam the ancient world, Dionysus. The oldest mention of Dionysus being linked to wine comes from Linear B tablets, which are ancient records from the Mycenaean civilization around the 13th century BCE. These tablets, found at places like Pylos and Knossos, mention a god named Dionyso, who is an early version of Dionysus. His name appears alongside Linear B wine offerings, Wino, W-I-N-O, all the way back in the Bronze Age, which debunked the notion that he was imported into the Greek pantheon in the later 7th century BC. Fast forward from the 13th century, roughly 500 years after this, and around the 7th and 8th centuries BC, Hesiod and Homer mention Dionysus. Hesiod gives this god-man a mention as one of the many offspring of Zeus and Princess Semele, but gives no description of wine. His list was a genealogy. However, in the Iliad, Book 6, Tydeus, son of Oeneus, legendary warrior of the generation before the Trojan War, speaks about King Lycurgus daring to oppose Dionysus, trying to drive away the god and his followers. Dionysus flees, but Zeus blinds Lycurgus, leading to his death, a powerful warning to those who defy the god of ecstasy and madness. Experts suggest this Dionysus story may go back before the 8th century BCE. This Theomachos, or god fighter in Greek, is shown to be a trend here in Homer and later with Euripides' tragedy, The Bacchae. Pentheus, the king of Thebes, is depicted as a classic Theomachos, a god fighter, in his opposition to the god Dionysus. This parallels Sophocles, who we will discuss shortly, but you know where this shows up again? in the book of Acts and John's Gospel? Christ and Paul play the part of the new Dionysus character, being attacked by the Jews. Interestingly, in Acts chapter 5, the Pharisee Gamaliel warns the Sanhedrin that if the Christian movement is from God, opposing it would make them theomakoi, fighters against God.
Refrain from these men and let them alone. For if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught. But if it be of God, you cannot overthrow it. Be careful, therefore, lest you be found even to fight against God.
Gamaliel advises caution, suggesting that if God is truly behind the apostles' mission, no amount of human resistance will succeed. It's worth noting, too, in the Iliad, Euripides, and Sophocles, the cult, the group of the god of Dionysus and his followers, are persecuted. This is exactly the trend we find in the New Testament with the Christian cult. In the Odyssey, Book 24, Dionysus is briefly mentioned when Telemachus receives his beautiful golden cup, crafted by Hephaestus. Though these mentions are brief, they remind us of Dionysus's divine importance connected to wine, revelry, and the power to punish. The unmixed wine connects to Dionysus this early. Homer is said to have written these books in the 8th century BC, between 750 and 700 BC. It doesn't stop here. We have the Homeric hymn to Dionysus written around the 7th to 6th century BC. This story is a bit more detailed, showing Dionysus as a powerful transformative wine god, but much, much more than just wine. First of all, sweet, fragrant wine ran streaming throughout all the black ship, and a heavenly smell arose, so that all the seamen were seized with amazement when they saw it. And all at once, a vine spread out both ways along the top of the sail, with many clusters hanging down from it, and a dark ivy plant twined about the mast, blossoming with flowers and with rich berries growing on it, and all the thole pins were covered with garlands. Here, Dionysus performs a miraculous act on a ship. Sweet wine flows throughout, filling the air with its fragrance, while grapevines and ivy rapidly grow around the mast and sail. Flowers bloom, and garlands cover the oar pins, transforming the vessel into a living, thriving wonder. This scene showcases Dionysus's power to bring life and abundance even in the most unexpected places, demonstrating his divine connection to nature, fertility, and intoxication. The awe of the sailors underscores his transformative power and his role as the bringer of joy and vitality. I begin to sing of ivy-crowned Dionysus, the loud crying god, splendid son of Zeus and glorious Semele. The rich-haired nymphs received him in their bosoms from the Lord his father, and fostered and nurtured him carefully in the dells of Nysa, where by the will of his father he grew up in a sweet-smelling cave, being reckoned among the immortals. But when the goddesses had brought him up, a god oft-hymned, then began he to wander continually through the woody combs, thickly wreathed with ivy and laurel. And the nymphs followed in his train with him for their leader, and the boundless forest was filled with their outcry. And so hail to you, Dionysus, god of abundant clusters. Grant that we may come again rejoicing to this season, and from that season onward for many a year. In hymn 26, Dionysus is introduced as the splendid son of Zeus and glorious Semele. Raised by nymphs in the dells of Nysa, he is connected to nature from birth. Covered in ivy and laurel, he wanders through the woods, leading the nymphs in ecstatic celebration. This hymn paints Dionysus as a god of the wild and a leader of revelry, embodying nature's untamed energy and bringing joy and life to all who follow him. Dionysus is more than just the god of wine. He is a force of transformation, vitality, and communal ecstasy. This transformation power later becomes pneumatic or spiritual transformation. His worshippers experienced this when they were filled by his spirit through communion with the deity, just like Jesus later possesses his followers by the Spirit. This was written 600 to 700 years before Jesus, having Dionysus turn a ship into a vineyard of wine. Oh, but it gets better. In Euripides' Bacchae, written around 405 BCE, that's the 5th century BCE, a Maenad struck the ground with her thyrsus, and the god at that spot put forth a fountain of wine. Then they crowned their hair with leaves, ivy and oak, and flowering bryony. One woman struck her thyrsus against a rock, and a fountain of cool water came bubbling up. Another drove her fennel in the ground, and where it struck the earth, at the touch of God, a spring of wine poured out. Those who wanted milk scratched at the soil with bare fingers, and the white milk came welling up. Here Dionysus produces water, wine, and milk from the earth, just as Yahweh was said to bless the land of Canaan with flowing milk and honey. Yeah, I know, apologists. It's not water into wine. Don't go anywhere, because we will get there. You know, from as early as the 2nd century AD, people were already noticing how John's Gospel parallels the story of Dionysus in the Bacchae by Euripides. Origen, a well-known Christian scholar, pointed out that Celsus, depends on how you want to pronounce his name, a philosopher who opposed Christianity, highlighted similarities between Jesus' arrest in John 18 and Dionysus' capture in the Bacchae. Celsus argued that Jesus, during his arrest, didn't act like a true God in disguise. If Jesus really was divine, Celsus claimed, he would have escaped his bonds and scattered his captors, just as Dionysus does. Celsus criticized Jesus, asking, why doesn't he show his divine power and free himself from this humiliation, taking revenge on those who insult him and his Father? He also complained that figures like Annas and Pilate, who unlawfully interrogated Jesus, went unpunished, unlike in the Bacchae, where Pentheus is severely punished for doubting Dionysus. Celsus noted that the one who condemned Jesus does not even suffer the same fate as Pentheus by going mad or being torn to pieces. It's been argued by the amazing Dennis R. MacDonald that Jesus is showing mercy where Dionysus shows wrath or vengeance, making Jesus as a more compassionate God. He also says, a divine figure, offspring of a divine father and human mother, takes on flesh to live among mortals, but is rejected by his own, miraculously provides wine, includes women as his close devotees, dies a violent death, and returns to life? MacDonald suggests that the author of John's Gospel intentionally incorporated these Dionysian motifs to present Jesus as a figure greater than Dionysus. He states, the Johannine evangelist not only imitated Euripides, but expected his readers to recognize Jesus as greater than Dionysus. Either way you slice it, this shows that there has been a long tradition of seeing Dionysian themes in John's Gospel from the very beginning of Christianity. This approach continues in modern scholarship. For example, Rudolf Bultmann, a respected scholar, discusses the same comparisons that Celsus made in his commentary on John 18 through 19. Additionally, Robert Thompson Fortna sees a parallel between Jesus' first miracle in John 2, turning water into wine, and Dionysian themes. Fortna writes that the water into wine miracle is a legendary account that resembles the deeds of gods in Greek traditions, specifically Dionysus, which predate the gospel. Like Dionysus, Jesus reveals his identity through this act, displaying his divine power, transforming water into wine. Look, it's abundantly clear that many scholars have seen Dionysian echoes in John's Gospel over the centuries. These connections help validate a reading of John's Gospel as following a tragic structure similar to Greek narratives rooted in Dionysian mythology. In order to fully understand John as a kind of tragic drama, we need to look more closely at how Euripides reinterprets the Dionysus myth in the Bacchae, and see if it influenced John's storytelling. The story of the Bacchae unfolds as follows. Dionysus, the god of wine, appears at the beginning of the play and introduces himself in the prologue. He calls himself the son of Zeus and explains why he has come to Thebes. I have returned to Thebes, the land where I was born, and here I stand, a god in disguise, appearing as a man. We learn from his speech that Dionysus' father is Zeus, making him divine, while his mother was the mortal Semele. He has returned to Thebes because his mortal relatives are spreading rumors about his mother lying about being impregnated by the god Zeus. In effect, they were denying his divinity, just like the Jews accused of Jesus in John 8:41. We were not born of fornication. Only his grandfather, Cadmus, has honored his mother's tomb. So Dionysus decides to return home, strike his aunts with madness, and reveal himself as the son of Zeus to everyone. Dionysus' main opponent in this story is his cousin Pentheus, the king of Thebes and grandson of Cadmus. Dionysus describes Pentheus as rebelling against the divine because he refuses to worship him. When Pentheus appears on stage, he denounces Dionysian worship as obscene disorder and insults Dionysus as a charlatan magician. Pentheus even mocks his grandfather Cadmus and the prophet Tiresias for dressing in Dionysian attire to honor the god. Tiresias warns Pentheus not to mock the will of heaven, reminding him that Dionysus' gift of wine takes away the sorrows of mankind and is the true medicine for misery. He urges Pentheus to accept Dionysus, explaining that worshipping Dionysus can bring favor from the gods. Cadmus also begs Pentheus to recognize Dionysus' divinity, saying that if it's a noble fiction, it still brings honor to their family, but Pentheus refuses to listen, even ignoring the warning about a terrible punishment for defying Dionysus, like the one Actaeon suffered for blaspheming Artemis. Pentheus dismisses Tiresias and Cadmus, telling them not to spread their madness to him. Angry at his family's weakness, Pentheus orders his men to arrest the effeminate stranger, Dionysus in disguise, who has fooled the old men. Dionysus lets himself be captured and is brought before Pentheus, leading to a tense, mocking dialogue. Pentheus ultimately locks Dionysus in a dark cell within the palace. However, Pentheus has underestimated his captive. Dionysus shatters the palace with an earthquake and escapes unscathed. At this point, a messenger reports to Pentheus about the wild revelries of the women, including Pentheus's mother Agave in the mountains. Furious, Pentheus decides to attack the women with an army. Dionysus persuades him that it would be better to observe them in disguise. Convincing Pentheus to dress as a woman, once there, Dionysus tells him to climb a tall tree for a better view. But the women spot him, and in their madness tear him apart, believing he is a wild animal. Agave herself brings Pentheus's head back to Thebes, only realizing the horror of her actions once her madness fades. In the end, Dionysus punishes all who opposed him, re-establishing his divinity. When we examine the Bacchae, we could see structural and thematic similarities with John's Gospel, but also the book of Acts. We're just going to focus on John's Gospel though, suggesting that John may have drawn on this Dionysian story. Here are some of the general parallels. 1. Rejection by family. In both stories, a divine figure returns home but is rejected by his family. In John, Jesus came to his own, and his own did not receive him. John 1:11. While the Bacchae, Dionysus returns to Thebes and is scorned by his mortal relatives. 2. Unrecognized divinity. Dionysus and Jesus both come as gods in disguise and are not recognized by those around them. Dionysus arrives in Thebes as a mysterious stranger, while Jesus is repeatedly misunderstood and rejected. 3. Wine and salvation. Dionysus brings wine as a medicine for misery, to relieve human suffering, while Jesus offers a wine as his blood, promising spiritual life, as in John chapter 2, with the water into wine miracle, and John 6, with references to his blood. 4. Failure to recognize kinship. In both stories, the central tragedy lies in the antagonist's failure to recognize a family connection with the divine figure. In the Bacchae, Pentheus doesn't see that, as the grandson of Cadmus, the father of Semele, he is in a way a brother to Dionysus, the god-man. Similarly, in John, the Jewish leaders, as antagonists, and Jesus, the protagonist, share the same father in heaven. This makes them brothers in a spiritual sense, but unlike Jesus' unique and complete relationship with the Father, their connection remains unfulfilled. 5. Humiliation and death on a tree. Both Dionysus and Jesus undergo mockery and are lifted up. Pentheus is humiliated, dresses in women's clothes, and is ultimately killed in a tree, while Jesus is mocked, dressed in a robe, crowned with thorns, and lifted up on a cross, a tree. 6. Faithful women. Women play a central role as true worshippers of the deity in both stories. In John, devoted women like Mary are at the cross, while the Bacchae women worship Dionysus with utmost devotion. 7. Enemies attempt to capture the deity. Both stories involve god fighters, theomakoi, exactly what I talked about earlier, who tried to imprison the deity but fell, ultimately leading to their own downfall. Mind you, in the book of Acts, this happens with Paul and Peter, and the prison breaks open due to an earthquake, just like Dionysus. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and that's a whole different video. 8. Mysterious nature of the deity. Both Dionysus and Jesus display elusive, mysterious qualities, making it difficult for people to understand or capture them. 9. City as symbol of rejection. The city represents established religion and resistance to new spiritual truths. In the Bacchae, Thebes is where Dionysus is opposed by Pentheus, while in John, Jerusalem becomes the center of resistance to Jesus' message. 10. Multiple tragic figures. Just as the Bacchae centers not only on Dionysus but also on Pentheus, John's Gospel involves multiple characters, Jesus, the Jews, and Pilate, contributing to the overall tragedy. Clearly, the Gospel of John shows significant structural and thematic resemblances to the Bacchae, suggesting that John may have shaped his story of Jesus using elements from Dionysian tragedy. This highlights how John's portrayal of Jesus was viewed through a lens similar to Greek tragedy, where a divine figure faces rejection, ultimately revealing his true power. Thanks for the insights from a scholar, Mark W.G. Steib, in his book John as Storyteller, Narrative Criticism in the Fourth Gospel. Now let's check out Sophocles. One of the greatest ancient Greek tragedians wrote Antigone around 441 BC, way before Jesus, and roughly around the same time as Euripides. And in this powerful play, he gives us a glimpse of Dionysus that goes far beyond the god of wine and festivity. In the fifth stasimon, the chorus calls upon Dionysus as the one who watches over Italy and rules in all receiving vows of Eleusinian Deo. This shows Dionysus' deep connection to the Eleusinian mysteries, ancient sacred rites about life, death, and rebirth. Dionysus was not just a god of revelry, but also a spiritual guide, linked to profound ceremonies about the cycle of life. Sophocles also illustrates the terrifying power of Dionysus in a story told by the chorus. They recount how Dryas' son, the Edonian king, dared to mock Dionysus' authority. As punishment, Dionysus imprisoned him in a rocky cave, forcing the king to experience firsthand the wrath of a god. And Dryas' son, the Edonian king, swift to rage, was tamed in recompense for his frenzied insults, when by the will of Dionysus, he was shut in a rocky prison. There the fierce and swelling force of his madness trickled away. That man came to know the god whom in his frenzy he had provoked with mockeries. For he had sought to quell the god-inspired women and the bacchanalian fire, and he angered the muses who love the flute. Sophocles, Antigone, lines 955 to 965. It's clear that defying Dionysus was not an option. He could tame even the most defiant, making clear the futility of resisting his divine followers. This theme of divine punishment shows up later in Christian literature. With the Jews rejecting Christ as the Son of God, they meet their demise in the Roman-Jewish War. As observed in Homer long ago, the persecution of the Dionysian followers echoes the Book of Acts, which Euripides and Sophocles echoed long before Christians dreamt of persecution narratives. These references make it clear that Dionysus was far more than a carefree deity of festivity. Sophocles presents him as a god of immense cosmic power, capable of initiating followers into profound mysteries and punishing those who challenged his authority. Dionysus was a force to be reckoned with, a divine being whose influence stretched from life to death, touching every part of existence with his power. We even find 5th century BC golden leaves in the mysteries of Dionysus, where promise of a rebirth and blessed afterlife, showing that Dionysus was the god over the dead, similar to how Jesus was later seen as rescuing the dead from Hades. How many voices from the ancient world should I raise to get my point across that long before Jesus, Dionysus was the god of wine? Of course, the slippery move by apologists is the details. Remember, the devil is in the details. Michael Jones technically said,
So sometimes they'll bring up Dionysus and they'll say Dionysus turned water into wine. Yeah, that comes from a 3rd century text. Postdates the New Testament. Shut up.
It feels like he almost wants an exact source before the Christian literature, where Dionysus turns water into wine. Dionysus not only does such things in sources before the New Testament was even written, but also transforms empty jars into wine and even performs situations where wine turns into water when you distance yourself from this god's presence. When I first started crafting this response, I really didn't realize how absolutely insane this rabbit trail would be. I worked on this with my close friend Neil Sinlak from Gnostic Informant, and we were both blown away by what we discovered. Buckle up for this ride. First, let's mention the early 5th century Herodotus. Herodotus mentions Dionysus in the Histories. Specifically in Book 2, Herodotus draws a parallel between the Greek god Dionysus and the Egyptian god Osiris, particularly in terms of their association with wine and rituals. He also mentions the Ethiopians who lived around the region of Nisa, stating that they held festivals in honor of Dionysus. We have another very powerful tale of Dionysus and wine by Theopompus, who was preserved in the writings of Athenaeus. Theopompus wrote between 380 to 320 BC, though his writings appear in the work of Athenaeus. Athenaeus wrote the Dionysus during the late 2nd century to early 3rd century AD, roughly between 170 and 230 AD. He was a Greek rhetorician and grammarian from Naucratis, Egypt. His work is a lengthy compilation of discussions held during a banquet, touching on a wide variety of subjects including food, literature, history, and mythology, and preserving numerous fragments from earlier authors. His work is extremely important for knowing about earlier sources and so many topics. Here is Theopompus's tale. Theopompus the Chian says that the vine is found at Olympia, near the Alpheus, and that there is a place about 8 furlongs from Elis, where the natives at the time of the Dionysian Games close up 3 empty bronzen vessels and seal them in the presence of all the people round about. And at a subsequent time, they open them and find them full of wine. Again, Dionysus miraculously fills 3 empty jars with wine. Only a god can do such things. Here, the source continues to mention Hellanicus and Dion. My point is, though this guy is writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd century AD, he's clearly drawing off much earlier sources. Hellanicus of Lesbos was a Greek historian who lived during the 5th century BCE, approximately 490 to 405 BC. He was one of the earlier Greek historians even before Herodotus and Thucydides. Dion of Prusa, also known as Dion Chrysostom, was an academic philosopher and orator who lived during the 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, approximately 40 to 115 AD. He was active during the reigns of Roman emperors such as Vespasian, Domitian, and Trajan, even around during the life of the Apostle Paul. He was not a Christian. He was writing at a time when Christianity was in its formative years, not even significant in the world at the time. Again, Athenaeus relates, "And so Sabias, the Lacedaemonian, after stating that the fig tree was the discovery of Bacchus, says that on this account the Lacedaemonians worship Bacchus Sukites. But the people of Naxos, as Asdriscus and Asclepiades related, state that Bacchus is called Malichius because of his gift of the fruit of the fig tree, and that on this account the face of the god whom they call Bacchus Dionysus is like a vine, and that of the god called Bacchus Malichius is like a fig, for figs are called Milica by the Naxians." Eusebius of Lacedaemon, Sparta, was likely a 3rd century BC Greek historian, and Andriscus and Asclepiades are likely Hellenistic writers from the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, discussing mythological topics. This means that many of these stories about Dionysus performing many signs and wonders throughout the world were known long before Jesus. We forgot to mention, On Marvelous Things Heard is a collection of fascinating and unusual stories and observations attributed to Aristotle or his followers. The work isn't a major philosophical treatise, but rather a compilation of strange and surprising facts about nature, animals, plants, and different cultures. It dates back to around 350 BC and falls into the genre known as paradoxography, which focuses on recording odd or amazing phenomena. Though it's often linked to Aristotle, many scholars believe it was written or compiled by later members of his school. In Ellis, they say there's a building about 8 stadies from the city into which, at the Dionysia, they place 3 empty bronze cauldrons. When they have done this, they call upon any of the visiting Greeks who wishes to examine the vessels and seal up the doors of the house. When they are going to open it, they show the seals to citizens and strangers and then open it. Those that go in find the cauldrons full of wine, but the ceiling and walls intact, so that there's no suspicion that they affect it by any artifice or deceit. They also say that there are kites among them which seize pieces of meat from those who are carrying them through the marketplace, but they do not touch those which are offerings to the gods. 3 empty bronze cauldrons miraculously filled with wine during the Epiphany of Dionysus? It also describes a strange behavior where the birds recognize the divine nature of the offerings to the god and avoid snatching up meat offered to Dionysus. The birds know the god of creation. Long before Jesus and well after, Dionysus wasn't just a god of wine. He was its master, and technically the master of all creation. Pausanias 6:26, 1-2. Between the marketplace and the Menus is an old theater and a shrine of Dionysus. The image is the work of Praxiteles, of the god of the Ilians worship Dionysus with the greatest reverence, and they assert that the god attends their festival, the Thea. The place where they hold the festival they named the Thea is about 8 stadies from the city. 3 pots are brought into the building by the priest and set down empty in the presence of the citizens and of any strangers who may chance to be in the country. The doors of the building are sealed by the priests themselves and by any who may be so inclined. On the morrow, they are allowed to examine the seals, and on going into the building they find the pots filled with wine. I did not myself arrive at the time of the festival, but the most respected Ilian citizens, and with them strangers also, swore that what I have said is the truth. The Andrians, too, assert that every other year, at their feast of Dionysus, wine flows of its own accord from the sanctuary. If the Greeks are to be believed in these matters, one might with equal reason accept what the Ethiopians above Syene say about the table of the sun. 3 empty pots are miraculously filled, again repeating the same trope. Interesting. This is the same tradition Aristotle accounts, or his followers, around 350 BC, long before Jesus. Pausanias was a Greek traveler and writer from the 2nd century AD, who left us one of the best guides to ancient Greece. In his book, Description of Greece, he describes important places, temples, and traditions, including how the Greeks worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine and celebration. Pausanias traveled through many cities, noting that each one had its own unique way of honoring Dionysus, showing the god's widespread importance. His work is especially valuable because it shows what people believed before the rise of Christianity, capturing a time when ancient gods and rituals were still central to daily life across Greece. Michael Jones asserted that the earliest account of Dionysus turning water into wine happens to be a 3rd century text, which is after the New Testament.
Just making shit up.
Here's where he will be proven false, but I'm truly curious to know what kind of magical illusion he will perform to get out of this one. First thing we need to recognize is that Athenaeus, writing between 170 and 230 AD, is literally quoting works from the centuries before Jesus, well into the 3rd, 4th, even 5th centuries BC. But guess what? We don't even need to use a 3rd century source. Of course, texts from the 3rd century AD have Dionysus doing wine miracles, because the tradition of this god performing miraculous wonders with wine and nature stretched back into classical Greece and even into the deeper past. What we need is water into wine miracles that clearly indicates that this particular type of miracle happened before Jesus. If we can show sources which indicate this exact order and detail, I wonder what kind of excuse we will get next. Let me set this up so no one misses it. Pliny the Elder was a Roman naturalist, philosopher, and military officer who lived from 23 to 79 AD, exactly around the same time as the Apostle Paul. He was technically a polytheist. His writings reflect a worldview influenced by traditional Roman and Hellenistic thought. The Natural History, his famous encyclopedic work, draws on classical knowledge and Roman religious customs with no reference to Christianity. In fact, Pliny's nephew, Pliny the Younger, who lived from 61 to 113 AD, had a later interaction with Christianity. Around 112 AD, Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor and wrote to Emperor Trajan seeking advice on how to handle Christians in his jurisdiction. His letter is one of the earliest Roman documents to explicitly mention Christians, suggesting that Christianity had grown more visible after Pliny the Elder's time. Pliny the Elder's The Natural History, written between 77 and 79 AD before his death, is a sweeping survey of knowledge from ancient Greece and Rome, covering everything from plants and animals to far-off lands and cultural quirks. Drawing on the works of Aristotle, Strabo, Varro, and others, Pliny mixes Greek science, Roman agriculture, and first-hand reports from travelers to create a comprehensive picture of this world. His curiosity didn't stop at science. He also delves into myth, like stories of Dionysus and miraculous fountains, showing his fascination with both earthly wonders and divine mysteries. Pliny's careful sourcing and skepticism made his work a trusted guide to the ancient world's knowledge and lore. He wrote this with absolutely zero influence of Christianity. No one worth their salt thinks this guy used Christian sources. For crying out loud, his nephew never even heard of these Christians when dealing with them. My point is that Pliny the Elder is drawing off much older and contemporary sources from that 1st century time for his thoughts, and he has a message for Michael Jones and anyone peddling the false statement that Dionysus never turned water into wine before Christianity.
Well, it's all nonsense. He's turned water into wine. Yeah, that comes from a 3rd century text. Postdates the New Testament. Shut up.
This isn't all nonsense, and no, we don't need to shut up. Eudoxus says that persons who drink the water of Lake Clitorius taste a distaste for wine, and Theopompus asserts that the waters of the springs already named are productive of inebriety. According to Mucianus, there is a fountain at Andros, that water fountain, consecrated to Father Liber, Dionysus, from which wine flows during the 7 days appointed for the yearly festival of that god, the taste of which becomes like that of water the moment it is taken out of the sight of the temple. Pliny the Elder, Natural History 31:13. Did you notice Pliny says there is a strange fountain in Andros where during the gods' feast the water tasted unmistakably like wine, the taste of which becomes like that of water the moment it is taken out of the sight of the temple. Pliny 31:13. At certain times of the year, specifically January 5th through 7th, the water turns to wine for 7 days every year during the festival of Dionysus' Epiphany. And if you take this wine from this fountain out of the sight of the temple where the god's presence was located, the wine would become water. Honestly, this cannot get any more obvious that Dionysus turns a fountain of water each year. It flows with water year in, year out. That is what it does. But for 7 days of that year, it transforms that water into wine. And when you leave the site of the temple with the wine, it turns to water again. This is explicitly saying that a fountain at Andros which ran with water was transformed into wine during 7 days of the year. Water into wine? Hello? Mucinous, who was 3 times consul of Vespasian, a pretty important, powerful dude, and his rise to fame in the year of the 4 emperors, vouched for this as well. It is accredited by the Mucinous, who was 3 times consul, that the water flowing from a spring in the temple of Father Liber, Dionysus' title in Latin, on the island of Andros, always has the flavor of wine on nones of Janus, January 5th through 7th. The day is called God's Gift Day, Theodosia. Pliny the Elder, Natural History, Book 2, 231. Holy smokes. The tale of the Andros fountain, dedicated to Dionysus, or Liber in Roman terms, comes from Mucinous, a Roman historian and contemporary of Pliny in the 1st century AD. These stories clearly stretch way back into the past from their time in the 1st century. For the ancient Greeks, these festivals weren't mere legends. They were a testament to a god whose miracles flowed freely, intoxicating minds and spirits long before Christianity arrived with its own stories of miraculous feasts. Dionysus was and remained the ultimate god of the vine. I want you to notice the January 5th through 7th, and it's a special day called God's Gift Day, Theodosia. That's really important as we understand later what Christians do with this exact same time of the year. In fact, to the very day. At the temple of Dionysus in the city of Teos, a miracle took place that would resonate through the centuries. Every year, on specific days, a spring at the temple didn't produce water, but wine, with a fragrance unlike any other. This divine marvel wasn't a simple transformation. It was proof to the people of Teos that Dionysus himself was among them, the same way that the first act showing Jesus was divine was water into wine, Epiphany. Diodorus Siculus, around 50 BC, well before Jesus, and especially the Gospels, writes, "Now these accounts of the birth of Dionysus are generally agreed upon by the ancient writers, but rival claims are raised by not a few Greek cities to having been the place of his birth. The people of Elis and Naxos, for instance, and the inhabitants of Eleutherae and Teos and several other peoples, state that he was born in their cities. The Teons advance as proof that the god was born among them the fact that, even to this day, at fixed times in their city, a fountain of wine of unusually sweet fragrance flows of its own accord from the earth. And as for the peoples of the other cities, they in some cases point out a plot of land which is sacred to Dionysus. In other cases, shrines and sacred precincts which have been consecrated to him from ancient times. Diodorus Siculus, Bibliotheca, 50 BC. This means that they claim that only on certain days the fountain usually flows with water, except for these holy days of Dionysus. Yes, again, in a source from before Jesus shows that water was transformed into wine. Dionysus was the original, true vine. On the Aegean island of Naxos, wine gushed forth from a spring, a miracle that first occurred when Dionysus married Ariadne there. See Seneca's Oedipus, lines 491, written between 40 and 60 AD. Sacred Catherion flowed with blood from Ophion's slaughter. Protides sought the forests, and Argos honored Bacchus in the presence of his stepmother. Bacchus is Dionysus. Naxos, adorned by the Aegean Sea, gave the abandoned virgin to the marriage bed, compensating the loss with a better husband. The Nyctilian stream flowed from the dry pumice stone. Chattering streams cut through the grass, and the high ground drank the sweet juices. Pure fountains of white milk and lesbian thyme mixed with the fragrant herbs. The new bride is led to the vast heavens. Phoebus sings the solemn hymn with his hair falling on his shoulders, and twin cupids shake their torches. Jupiter laid down his fiery weapon and hated the thunderbolt, with Bacchus arriving. As long as the bright stars of the aged universe run their course, as long as ocean surrounds the enclosed world with waves, as long as the full moon gathers the scattered lights, as long as Lucifer foretells the morning's rise, and the deep blue Nereus does not know the high Arctic, we will revere the fair face of beautiful Laius, Bacchus, Dionysus. It's very important to notice this theme of marriage, which sparks the act of transforming nature into wine and milk from a dry stone, similar to how Moses strikes the stone in the wilderness, and Christ is said to be that stone or rock in the wilderness experience in Exodus, written by Paul in his letters. Here we have a story where a marriage celebration and a wine miracle long before the Gospels were penned. We have so many earlier wine miracle accounts long before the Gospels that just like Nonnus in the 5th century AD being influenced by Christian sources, we should see the colossal Dionysus stories which reigned the day to give inspiration to Jesus and the New Testament Gospels. By the way, I'm not just making these connections up. Several experts have noticed these connections for centuries. I just did my homework and actually opened the ancient sources up myself and read them, accompanied by academics who are seeing what I'm seeing. Plutarch, a Greek historian and philosopher, lived from 46 to 120 AD and wrote during the late 1st and 2nd centuries AD. He lived when Paul lived. He was what you would call an elite thinker and writer whose work would have been the highest standard in that day. In his work, he describes an extraordinary spring near Thebes called Sisusa, linked to Dionysus from the god's infancy. According to the legend, Dionysus's nurses bathed him in this spring shortly after his birth, and the waters took on a miraculous nature. But those of the Thebans who had remained outside, taking the city on their left, advanced upon the rear of their enemy at the spring called Sisusa. Here, as the story goes, his nurses bathed the infant Dionysus after his birth, for the water has the color and sparkle of wine, is clear, and very pleasant to the taste. Lysander 28:4. The water didn't just glisten like wine, it shared its fragrance and taste, showing Dionysus's divine influence. This myth, in which Dionysus transforms ordinary water into something resembling wine, highlights his power to alter nature and bring joy and abundance. Even as an infant, Dionysus demonstrates his mystical connection to life's richness and celebration, truly showing his power even as an infant. just like Jesus. What will apologists say now? Well, that wine miracle didn't happen at a wedding in Cana with 6 jars of water after the party drank up all the wine they currently had, saving the best for last. Derek, show me that exact myth before Jesus. This is hilarious. Not even the rewrites of Moses in Jesus are verbatim. Their standard is absurd and should be abandoned like a ditty party past 2 a.m. I didn't go into the various sources of marriage festivals of fertility and revelry done with Dionysian rites, which demands a further investigation, and trust me, it will be done in depth in the future. But for now, in the Bacchae, Euripides uses bridal imagery to show a deeply spiritual union between Dionysus and his followers, especially the Maenads, who enter ecstatic trances and shed their ordinary lives to join him in worship. This connection mirrors the concept of a eros gamos, or sacred marriage, where followers symbolically marry the divine, transcending earthly ties to experience transformation and unity with the god. For example, Agave and other Maenads abandon their social lives, including even motherhood, to join Dionysus, symbolizing a spiritual marriage to him that elevates them beyond conventional attachments. Later, the chorus refers to Dionysus as the bridegroom of joy, framing their ecstatic dance as a nuptial ceremony, merging themselves with him in a powerful union that erases boundaries between mortal and divine. This theme bears a strong resemblance to the Christian imagery of Jesus as the bridegroom of the church, where believers become one with him, echoing a spiritual marriage. Like Dionysus' followers, early Christians envisioned their connection to Jesus as both transformative and transcendent, creating a bond beyond worldly relationships. Both traditions capture the idea of surrendering to a divine partner, seeking liberation, unity, and spiritual rebirth. Further exploration, if you're interested in finding out more, see Ancient Mystery Cults by Walter Burkhardt and Dionysus, Archetypal Image of Indestructible Life by Carl Carini, which discusses the sacred marriage theme in Dionysian worship and its spiritual depth. Look, Dionysus worship in Palestine mattered because John, the gospel author, likely came from there. His knowledge of local geography, like Jacob's Well in Samaria, the Siloam Pool, and the Sheepgate Pool, proves he seemed to have awareness. John even translates Hebrew and Aramaic terms for a wider audience. Rabbi means teacher, Messiah means the anointed one, and Cephas means Peter. The stronger Dionysus worship was in Palestine and the Levant, the more John would feel compelled to address it as a rival to early Christianity. I mean, the fact remains, before Christianity took over, Dionysus was likely the top religious figure in the Eastern Roman Empire. His cult had deep roots in Palestine, especially among Hellenized populations. Wine was central to the local economy, so images of vine leaves, grapes, and drinking cups appeared on Jewish reliefs and coins. Coins from Damascus, Scythopolis, Raphia, Caesarea, Elia, and possibly Philadelphia, modern Amman, even showed Dionysus himself. Look at the map. All of these locations in the region we call Israel, Palestine, had coins uncovered, we've unearthed, that had Dionysus on them. This is literally in the backyard of Jesus himself. When Alexander the Great conquered the East, he turned the Galilean city of Beth Shean, which was just 18 miles southeast of Nazareth, into a Greek city named Scythopolis, honoring Dionysus' mythical Scythian guards. It was also called Nyssa Scythopolis, after the place where, according to myth, Dionysus was raised by a nymph named Nyssa. Dionysus was said to have been born and buried there. That's 18 miles from Jesus' Nazareth, and even founded the city. In the mid-3rd century BC, Pharaoh Ptolemy Philadelphus II, a huge Dionysus supporter, built up the city further. Statues and altars found by archaeologists confirm Dionysus worship was strong there, even all the way into the 2nd century AD. When Mark Antony, a huge Dionysus fan, arrived in Ephesus, he entered as Dionysus himself. The city's women came dressed as bacchantes, the men as satyrs, with thersoi, harps, and flutes. This is the cultural climate that the Apostle Paul faced when he started a church in Ephesus.
That is wild, isn't it? Just wild.
What have we discovered so far? Dionysus was the original god performing wine miracles. We've seen how, in places where Dionysus' presence was believed to dwell, springs and fountains, normally flowing with water, would miraculously turn to wine, sometimes for days at certain times of the year. In some accounts, 3 empty cauldrons would be found full of wine by morning. Other tales describe worshippers drinking this sweet wine in the temple when the god's presence was there and he appears, yet the moment they left his presence out of the sight of the temple, that wine reverted back to water, what it was to begin with. Pliny the Elder tells us that on the island of Andros, wine flowed from a spring between January 5th and 7th, a time attributed to the presence of Dionysus. Pausanias, in his description of Greece, and Athenaeus both echo this same event. Though they don't provide dates, thanks to Pliny, we can connect these sources to the same miraculous phenomenon, an epiphany of Dionysus' power on January 6th. It would be remarkable to get more specific dates for a similar event mentioned by Diodorus Siculus, who describes Dionysus' miracle at a temple in Teos. If it took place at the same time of year, that would be even more striking. Why? Because this account involves the infant Dionysus as a newly born deity, which turns out Christians later set the celebration of Jesus' birth and his epiphany on January 6th. Aligning with Dionysus' celebration, as described by Pliny, could it really be a coincidence that Christians chose to celebrate Jesus' epiphany on the exact same day as the ancient epiphany of Dionysus? Really? When you weigh out the evidence of Dionysus' influence in many other areas, not just wine miracles, on Jesus, it becomes pretty obvious to me that this is no coincidence. The same way Christians turned temples into churches and kept sacred spaces sacred, they likely did the same with sacred holidays and dates. Later, Macrobius wrote Saturnalia in the early 5th century AD, likely around 400 to 430 AD. In his Saturnalia, Book 1, 1810, Macrobius does suggest a connection between Dionysus, whom he calls by the Roman name Liber, and winter solstice celebrations. This opens up the Christmas can of worms, but let's close that door for now. Here's the bottom line. Did Christians find the celebrations of Dionysus on January 6th, which was clearly written and known in the whole world of the Roman Empire before Christianity, that Dionysus' myths with springs of water transforming into wine, having these miracles, showing his divine nature in the form of an epiphany? Would it shock you to find out that January the 6th has deeper connections to Jesus and Christians? Is it really wild speculation to assume Dionysus was the blueprint for Christians choosing this day? The connections between Jesus and Dionysus deepen. This video isn't focused on solidifying the New Testament connections to Dionysus in depth. You gotta see my Dionysus and Jesus documentary for more textual clues on these connections. The Christian Epiphany celebration of Jesus likely originated in the Greek-speaking eastern part of the Roman Empire as a feast to honor the baptism of Jesus. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, noted, "But the followers of the early Christian Gnostic religious teacher, Basilides, celebrate the day of his baptism too, spending the previous night in readings, and they say that it was the 15th of the month Tibi, of the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, and some say it was observed the 11th of the same month." Clement of Alexandria, circa 200 AD. The dates given corresponded January 6th and 10th. The followers of Basilides, a Gnostic sect, spent the night in readings, suggesting they were reading from the Gospels. Is it possible that their liturgical reading of Mark may have coincidentally led them to the celebration of Jesus' baptism on January 6th? Sure, but is there maybe more to it? The earliest mention of Epiphany as a Christian feast comes from Ammianus Marcellinus in 361 AD, where it is listed twice, possibly indicating a dual celebration of Jesus' baptism and birth. The connection between Jesus' birth and baptism may stem from a reading of Luke 3:23, which says Jesus was about 30 years old when baptized. Epiphanius of Salamis, writing between 374 to 377 AD in his work Panarion, refers to January 6th as Christ's birthday, that is, his Epiphany. He also says that the miracle at Cana happened on this day. According to Epiphanius, Jesus' baptism took place on November 6th. Christians don't always agree on dates here. He says, "For indeed the Savior was born in the 42nd year of the reign of Augustus, Emperor of the Romans, during his 13th consulship, together with Silanus, as recorded in the Roman consulships. It is stated thus: during their consulship, that is, the 13th of Octavius and Silanus, Christ was born 8 days before the calends of January, 13 days after the winter solstice, and the addition of light and day. This day is celebrated by the Greeks, the idolaters, on the 8th before the calends of January, which the Romans call Saturnalia, the Egyptians call Chronia, and the Alexandrians call Caecilia. For on the 8th before the calends of January, this division occurs, which is the solstice, and the day begins to increase as light gains addition, completing a number of 13 days up to the 8th before the calends of January, each day adding 30 hours up to the day of Christ's birth. As also the wise Ephraim among the Syrians testified to this word in his explanations, saying that thus was ordained the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, the birth according to the flesh, or rather the perfect incarnation, which is called Epiphany, from the beginning of the increase of light for a span of 13 days. For this also had to become a type of our Lord Jesus Christ and his 12 disciples, fulfilling the number of the 13 days of light's increase. And many other things have happened and happen in support and testimony of this word, that is, of Christ's birth. For even the leaders of the idolatry religion forced to confess a part of the truth, and the deceivers to deceive those convinced by them. Idolaters in many places conduct a great festival on that very night of the Epiphany, so that those hoping in the deception would not seek the truth. First in Alexandria, in the so-called Corium, there was a great temple that is the precinct of Cori. For staying awake the entire night with certain songs and flutes singing to the idol, and spending the whole night after the crowing of the roosters, they descend with torches into a certain underground shrine and bring out a certain wooden statue seated on a litter, naked, having a golden sill of a cross on the forehead, and 2 other such sills on each hand, and another 2 on the 2 knees. Together, the 5 sills made of gold, and they carry this statue around the middle temple 7 times with flutes and drums and hymns, and after celebrating they again bring it down into the underground place. Being asked what this mystery is, they reply and say that at this hour today, the Kori, that is, the Virgin, gave birth to Ion. This also happens in Petra, the city, the metropolis of Arabia, which is Edom, written in the scriptures, in the idol temple there, and they praise the Virgin in Arabic dialect, calling her in Arabic Kabu, that is Kori, or the Virgin, and the one born from her, Dusaris, that is the only begotten of the Lord. This also takes place in Alusa, the city on that night, as there in Petra and in Alexandria. Whoo, there is some stuff going on right here. Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in the 4th century, claimed that January 6th was both Jesus' birthday and the day of his epiphany, his divine appearance. He also said the miracle at Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine, happened on this same day. He places Jesus' baptism in a different date, of course, November 6th. He explains that Jesus was born during the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus and that his birth, which occurred shortly after the winter solstice, symbolized the increase of light in the world. Epiphanius points out that around this time, the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and others celebrated festivals marking the solstice and the rebirth of light. He describes how in these celebrations each day added light, symbolically linking this increase in light to Jesus' birth and his 12 disciples, making a total of 13. Epiphanius then criticizes pagan celebrations, saying they mimic Christian ideas. Real quick, that means he thinks these practices by these idolaters from various cultures stole and modeled the idea from Christ, from the Christian message. He describes one specific celebration in Alexandria where people worshipped the goddess Kori, that is Persephone, on January the 6th. During this festival, people stayed up all night singing, and at dawn brought out a statue marked with gold crosses, which they paraded through the temple as a symbolic birth of the god Ion. Ion is another name associated with Dionysus. Similar ceremonies happened in Petra and other cities where they celebrated the birth of a god called Dusaris, whom they believed was born of a virgin goddess called Kabu in Arabic, meaning the virgin or Kori. For those who might not know, Kori is another name for Persephone, who in some myths is considered the mother of Dionysus. This is a very powerful point because in Orphic mythology, in the Orphic mysteries of Dionysus, Persephone is the goddess of the underworld. Even Dionysus rescues her from the underworld. So having him born instead of from Semele, Persephone makes him the god of the living and the god of the dead. The name Ion is also used to refer to Dionysus in ancient writings. This connection between Ion and Dionysus is made by both early Christian and Neoplatonic writers. The sources that discuss this connection that we're not going to get into further is Proclus in his commentaries, especially on Plato's Timaeus, Iamblichus in De Mysteriis, Plotinus in the Aeneads, Damascius in De Principis, and W.K.C. Guthrie in History of Greek Philosophy Volume 1. He discusses these ideas on page 478. But as Christianity developed, January 6th, now Epiphany, became a celebration of Jesus' birth, the visit of the Magi, his baptism, and the miracle at Cana. By 354 AD, the Western Church split these celebrations, December 25th for Christmas and January 6th for Epiphany, dedicated to the Magi, baptism, and the wedding of Cana. Egeria, a pilgrim in 385 AD, described Epiphany festivities in Jerusalem and Bethlehem celebrating Jesus' birth. By the early 5th century, St. John Cassian recorded that Egyptian monasteries celebrated both nativity and baptism on January 6th, a tradition the Armenian Apostolic Church still honors to this very day, celebrating January 6th as the birth of Jesus. Here's what we've discovered so far. Jesus is late to the party. All the way in the 1st to 2nd centuries is his material. We went back in time, just giving you a glimpse of the earliest accounts of Dionysus appearing in history in Linear B. Fast forward to the earlier accounts in Greek history with Homer and Hesiod mentioning Dionysus under different circumstances. Then you see the Homeric hymn to Dionysus appear, writing again about this god of wine transforming a ship into a vineyard long before Jesus. Fast forward to many of the Greek authors and historians, Hellanicus of Lesbos, Sophocles, who wrote plays next to Euripides, and Herodotus. These are minds that are very influential throughout Greek history and later authors writing about Dionysus. Then we have Theopompus, who is mentioned in a later source, referencing his older sources. And then we have Eusebius and Aristotle, who are mentioning the wine miracles of Dionysus. They truly did pave the way for what later became Christianity in the miracles of Jesus. Then we see Apollodorus and Andriscus and Aglathenes. Also Ovid and Diodorus Siculus. All writing miracles of Dionysus and his power over nature. But as time fast forwards, Dionysus becomes even more and more and more than just a wine god. He is the Logos in Orphic mysteries, and these authors are showing how prevalent his cult is all around the Greco-Roman world, the very place where Christianity was birthed. So when you hear people resist that Jesus has influence from Dionysus, or they only want to insist that it was all later Christian influence, they truly are ignorant of what they're talking about. They are not looking at the sources with common sense. Look at how many authors are coming up before the material, or even around the time the material that the Gospels show up, and they all highlight, before this John's Gospel appears, about Dionysus' power over wine and much, much more. Here, P52, we've already noted, scholars think late 2nd, early 3rd century. That doesn't mean the gospel was written then. Likely was written a little earlier, sometime in the 2nd century. However, it was clearly indicating evidence of inspiration from the larger Greco-Roman world. And then we have authors during and after this period that I wanted to highlight we brought up during this documentary that give indication, clear indication, that they're all aware of the long-standing tradition of Dionysus. This is why many of the church fathers, when they separated Christianity and Jesus from Dionysus, wanted to divorce and say that actually they copied ours through the powers of Satan foreknowing in advance. So look at the map. See where the red line is? Look, that's where Jesus in the Gospel of John appears. We have to ignore all this other stuff earlier and pretend this particular story of Jesus was in a vacuum. Nice try, apologist. Notice we only focused on one claim by Apologist, specifically the water into wine claim by Michael Jones. Here's the truth. I had to cut out so much more information on sources because in all sections of this documentary, much, and I mean much more, can be added to solidify my point. I know from experience back when I was a believer that a war was happening inside me between my experience and the facts. I turned to Apologists and their confidence to make my faith intelligent and historically the one true religion. My venture into the unknown has led me to realize that it isn't really about the facts for them. It's much more about faith and security beyond this world, after this thing we call life. I mean, let's be real. Life is hard, and everyone looks for answers to its riddle. However, I choose the tough path of swimming upstream to what I was told and raised to believe. I do not want anyone watching this to target any specific apologist with hate or anger, but truly feel compassion and empathy for them. They are trapped in a vicious cycle of defending something which could never be proven. They strive to keep the castle from tumbling down. This castle or house of historical true faith and their apologetics would do better if they changed their tactics from making absurd claims. Just as Christ said, I now say. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. More people will rise up to the facts of Christianity rising within the mythic framework of all the popular gods and heroes in the world it was born into. It doesn't just look similar. It's literally lifting from the same cultural fabric and mythic literary themes of these other popular cults. Christianity, at its foundation, is another Yahwistic mystery cult with its demigod Jesus claiming to be the true vine, transforming water into wine as his first miracle, as an epiphany that he is truly divine, well after the famous tales of Dionysus doing the same thing. For me, this message truly is freeing. Showing the shared connections between these stories makes the world a bigger place, with less exclusivity and a shared heritage we can all appreciate. I love the stories of Jesus, just as I love the stories of the gods everywhere else. Sure, not everything is morally pretty, but these stories are our history, our stories from old. And the day we recognize these clear connections between these cultures, religions, and cults, etc., we will see less tribalism in religion. In the next documentary, we will bring our scalpel to William Lane Craig, and maybe I'll do a smackdown to the wild claim that Mithraism came after Christianity by Frank Turek. Please, we really could use your help out by joining our family on Patreon or becoming a YouTube membership. You can also support us with a one-time donation or buy a scholarly course. We have many brilliant academics at mvp-courses.com. We have James Tabor, we have M. David Litwa, Robin Faith Walsh, we have Kip Davis, Joshua Bowen. I mean, the list really goes on and on. Dennis R. McDonald, he got a mention in this video. He does one on Greek imitations in the Gospels. Please, help us out. You're helping yourself out as well. My partner and queen of MythVision, we run this as a family, and this is crowdfunded. Making these documentaries depend on your support, and we really appreciate everyone who does. From day one, there's been many supporters who still stick around, keeping these videos possible. So thank you so much. With this support, I literally wouldn't be able to make these videos. Thank you to everyone who supported our work, and never forget, we are MythVision.